In the depths of human memory, there exist moments when the collective force of a crowd transcends the limits of individual control, morphing into a living, unstoppable torrent that defies all reason and order. This is the story of one such night. A night when the convergence of ancient tradition, modern celebration, and fatal infrastructural flaws combined to unleash a horror that would leave an indelible mark on the souls of those who survived, and a nation that would forever mourn its loss. For centuries, the sacred pilgrimage site of Mount Meon in Israel had been a beacon for the devout, a repository of history and faith that resonated with the echoes of countless prayers. Its origins were shrouded in myth and memory, with the site evolving over the ages from a humble memorial to a grand Victorian-era complex. Despite its architectural beauty, the compound was an anachronism in many ways, a relic of an era when spiritual reverence took precedence over the pragmatic demands of safety and crowd control. Narrow corridors, steep staircases, and cramped passageways had been designed not to manage masses, but to accommodate a modest gathering of the faithful. And as time passed, these very features became the stage for an unimaginable tragedy. The annual Lag BaOmer celebrations were a time when the site pulsated with life and energy. It was a festival of fire and fervor, a ritual where bonfires lit the darkness, ancient songs mingled with the modern heartbeat of celebration, and tradition was renewed with every prayer. That particular year, however, carried an ominous air. As the grip of COVID-19 restrictions began to loosen, a surge of pilgrims descended upon Mount Meon with a zeal that belied the inherent dangers lurking within the ancient structure. Expectations of modest attendance were dashed by the reality of an overwhelming influx, a multitude that swelled the confines of the compound far beyond its designed capacity. As twilight gave way to night, the compound was transformed into a surreal landscape. The flickering glow of bonfires cast long, trembling shadows on weathered stone, creating an atmosphere that was both mystical and foreboding. Devotees moved as one through the labyrinthine corridors, their voices rising in a symphony of prayer and celebration. Yet beneath the surface of this vibrant tableau lay a ticking time bomb. The meticulously choreographed sequence of rituals, compressed into an unnaturally tight schedule, left little time for the safe dispersal of the throng. The very elements that once symbolized unity and shared purpose were now setting the stage for catastrophe. In the midst of the revelry, an insidious danger began to take shape. A steep, slippery descent, once a forgotten relic of architectural design, had become a deadly choke point. The descent led to a narrow, unforgiving staircase, whose metal surfaces and sharp turns were ill-equipped to handle the relentless pressure of a human tide. As the night progressed, and the celebratory fervor reached its apex, the pilgrims, caught in the fervent rush of exit, began to converge upon this fatal juncture. What started as an orderly departure devolved into a frenzied rush as hundreds of individuals found themselves pressed against each other, forced into an inescapable squeeze that would soon spiral into pandemonium. In those agonizing moments, the laws of physics and the frailties of human anatomy converged in a cruel dance of fate. The crowd surged forward with a momentum that was both relentless and indifferent to the pleas of individual reason. The passageway, slick with spilled drinks and the residue of countless labors of devotion, turned into a treacherous slide, an arena where the balance of each soul was precariously suspended. The narrow staircase, once a simple architectural feature, transformed into a labyrinth of terror, its every twist and turn magnifying the peril as bodies pressed in, layer upon layer, with no escape in sight. Amid the roar of desperation, the scene became a tableau of raw human emotion. Panic, despair, and an almost palpable terror that defied description. Shrieks of alarm and anguished cries were swallowed by the overwhelming cacophony of 1,000 souls caught in an unstoppable avalanche. In a surreal interplay of chaos and inevitability, the crowd's collective energy, once a manifestation of communal celebration, was now an indifferent force of nature. A force that cared not for the individual lives it was crushing. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment, a silent witness to the tragic futility of human endeavor against an overwhelming tide. As the fatal surge reached its crescendo, emergency responders found themselves confronting a nightmare of unprecedented scale. With vehicles struggling to penetrate the dense mass of human bodies, the chaos of the moment rendered conventional methods of rescue virtually useless. The compound's narrow passageways, already the stage of impending disaster, were further obstructed by debris and the unyielding pressure of the crowd. In those moments, every second was an eternity, a cruel race against time in which the cost of delay was measured in lives. The aftermath was a scene of unspeakable sorrow and stark horror. By the time the tragic tableau began to clear, the toll had become horrifyingly evident. 45 lives had been extinguished in a matter of minutes, and over 100 individuals were left injured, their futures marred by the scars of that fateful night. The compound, once a haven of spiritual solace, had become a tomb of shattered dreams and lost hope. In the days that followed, the nation was plunged into a state of collective grief and introspection. Investigations into the disaster peeled back layers of neglect, revealing a long history of warnings that had gone unheeded. Structural inadequacies, narrow passageways, insufficient exits, and poorly designed bottlenecks had been repeatedly identified over the years, yet efforts at reform had been thwarted by a combination of bureaucratic inertia and a rigid adherence to tradition. The tragedy was not an isolated event, it was the culmination of decades of systemic failure, a damning indictment of a complacency that had allowed history's warnings to be ignored until it was too late. The psychological scars inflicted by that night would prove as enduring as the physical devastation. Survivors recounted the surreal terror of being swept away by an unyielding force, a force that seemed to strip away the very essence of individuality and reduce each person to a mere fragment of a vast, uncontrollable mass. The experience left an indelible imprint on the collective psyche, a reminder of the fragile boundaries that separate order from chaos, and the catastrophic consequences that can arise when those boundaries are breached. Public outcry soon gave way to a fervent demand for accountability. High-ranking officials, from local security commanders to national political leaders, found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigations painted a damning picture of negligence and mismanagement. Testimonies emerged detailing how long-standing concerns about the site's safety had been systematically ignored, a chain of warnings that had been broken by the unyielding grip of tradition and the inherent resistance to change. The tragedy of Mount Meon was not simply a consequence of an unfortunate accident. It was the inevitable result of a long history of oversight, an indictment of a system that had prioritized ritual and heritage over human life. In the wake of the disaster, sweeping reforms were enacted. The pilgrimage site underwent a radical transformation as new protocols for crowd management and safety were introduced. Attendance was strictly limited, with detailed planning and robust security measures put in place to prevent any recurrence of the tragedy. Emergency response systems were overhauled, and a more coordinated approach to managing large-scale gatherings was adopted, aiming to ensure that the horror of that night would serve as a permanent reminder of the need for vigilance and proactive planning. Yet, even as these measures took root, the memories of that night continued to haunt those who had lived it. The survivors spoke of a surreal moment when time seemed to collapse, a moment when every heartbeat was a desperate struggle against the overwhelming force of the crowd. Their accounts were filled with a sense of profound loss, a lingering terror that transcended the physical pain and reached deep into the realm of the psychological. The tragedy had not only claimed lives, but had also irrevocably altered the inner landscapes of those who had been caught in its grip. As the nation grappled with its grief, the story of Mount Meon evolved into a cautionary tale, a dark parable of the intersection between ancient tradition and modern reality. It was a narrative that spoke of the dangers inherent in large-scale human gatherings, a reminder that even the most sacred spaces can become arenas of horror when the delicate balance of human order is disrupted. The tragedy served as a call to action, urging communities and authorities alike to confront the harsh realities of modern mass gatherings with the seriousness they deserved. In the long, reflective hours that followed the disaster, scholars, architects, and crowd dynamics experts pored over every detail of that night. They sought to understand how an event of such magnitude could spiral into chaos and what measures might be taken to safeguard future gatherings. Their analyses, often as chilling as the events themselves, revealed that the human body in motion is subject to the immutable laws of physics, laws that, when combined with flawed infrastructure and mismanagement, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The disaster at Mount Meon was not merely a historical anomaly. It was a stark demonstration of the perils that arise when human ambition collides with the limitations of physical space. In time, the lessons of that tragic night began to inform a broader discourse on public safety and urban planning. Regulatory bodies, once hesitant to intervene in matters of religious and cultural tradition, recognized the urgent need for reform. The haunting images of that night, of helpless individuals swallowed by an indifferent mass, became the impetus for change, driving a transformation in how large gatherings were planned and executed. The legacy of Mount Meon, though born of unspeakable loss, ignited a movement that sought to reconcile the demands of tradition with the imperatives of safety in a modern world. As the years passed, the scar of that night remained, a somber reminder etched into the collective memory of a nation. The site of Mount Meon, once a place of spiritual refuge, had been reimagined as a symbol of both mourning and resilience. It stood as a monument to those lost and as a beacon urging humanity to heed the warnings of the past. For every reform implemented, every safety measure introduced, there lingered the ghostly echo of a time when the sacred and the modern collided in a maelstrom of despair. In this enduring legacy of tragedy and transformation, the story of Mount Meon serves as a potent warning to all who dare to gather in large numbers. It is a narrative woven from the threads of history, loss, and the relentless pursuit of safety. A story that is as much about the human condition as it is about the inevitability of change. In the interplay between tradition and progress, between the individual and the collective, lies a truth as old as time, that even the most hallowed ground can become a stage for horror when vigilance is forsaken. This is Freak File channel that bring dark history and horror story to life via documentary. Join us as we peel back the layers of history to reveal the dark intersection of tradition, mismanagement, and catastrophic human error that cost lives in an instant. And remember, when the crowd becomes a killer and the echoes of history scream in blood, the horror is just beginning.